What if the miracle you've been waiting for didn't come from heaven, but from a battle-scarred Navy SEAL who stepped into a stranger's storm? On a
Please, miss, you
freezing
have to
Seattle
help
night,
us.
a
She's
terrified
dying.
girl
She needs
begged for medicine
medicine.
to save
Sorry,
her
we don't
dying
carry
kitten.
that kind of medication.
But
And
what am I
everyone
gonna
turned their
do?
back on her.
Please.
Everyone, except one man. Jake Roden, a soldier carrying his own wounds, refused to let despair win. With his loyal K9 shadow, he fought not with weapons, but with kindness powerful enough to rewrite 2 lives and save a 3rd. If you believe compassion can change the world, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and stay with us for more stories that prove miracles still walk among us. The midnight storm hammered Seattle with cold, unrelenting rain, swallowing the streets in a restless metallic roar. Inside that churning darkness, Jake Rowden moved like a shadow carved from the night itself, his broad frame wrapped in a soaked navy jacket that clung to his shoulders with the stubbornness of fatigue. At 34 years old, Jake carried the aura of a man forged by discipline, danger, and the brutal honesty of war. He stood 6'3", built with the powerful symmetry of a soldier who had lifted too many fallen brothers and sprinted under too many burning skies. His jawline was sharp, square, the edges slightly softened by a thin layer of exhaustion. A pale scar slashed diagonally across his cheek, a jagged reminder of the night he had lost his former K9 partner, Ranger, in an explosion that should have killed Jake too. His hair was short, military cut, dark brown, with the faintest streaks of early gray near his temples, a quiet tribute to years that had aged him faster than most men. His skin, lightly tanned, bore the constant tightness of someone who had lived too long under foreign suns. His eyes were striking, a deep storm blue, constantly alert, constantly scanning, the eyes of a man who had learned to expect violence even in the softness of home. Tonight, Jake walked with a controlled stiffness, the kind that came from a reopened wound along his ribcage earned during a training accident earlier in the week. It was supposed to be minor, but the cold rain made the ache brittle and sharp, threading through his bones like wire. He needed painkillers. He needed warmth. He needed silence. What he found was none of those things. The neon sign of the 24-hour convenience store flickered weakly as he stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming with a pathetic metallic stutter. The store smelled of old coffee, mop water, and artificial lemon cleaner, a strangely comforting contrast to the storm thrashing just outside. Jake shook off the rain and adjusted the hood of his jacket, willing his sore ribs not to wince as he moved. His breathing remained steady, disciplined, even though the pain pulsed like a slow bruise inside his chest. He had survived far worse. He reminded himself of that every day. He walked toward the back aisle, boots thumping lightly on the faded tile floor, when he heard it, soft, trembling, a sound shaped by desperation. A voice, young, breathless, feminine. "Please, he won't make it through the night. I beg you, sir, just something, anything to help him." Jake turned, and there she stood, a young woman drenched from the rain, clutching a tiny bundle of orange and white fur against her chest. She could not have been more than 26. Her name, though Jake did not know it yet, was Mara Ellis, a cashier at a local grocery store and caregiver to a sick mother confined to a small subsidized apartment across town. Mara was slender, but not fragile, with a strength that grew not from muscle, but from necessity. Her black hair, soaked completely through, clung to her face. Her skin was pale, but flushed from running in the cold. Her eyes, wide, amber, trembling, held a fear Jake recognized instantly. The fear of losing someone precious. She wore a cheap gray coat, the fabric fraying at the sleeves, and shoes so worn the soles had begun to detach at the edges. In her arms, wrapped in a thin towel, was a kitten, no older than 4 months, its small body shuddering with fever. Its fur had once been bright, vibrant orange, but now it lay flattened and dull against its fragile frame. Its breathing was shallow, raspy, and too slow. The kitten's name was Ember. The man standing before her behind the counter was tall and thin, wearing a store uniform 2 sizes too big. His name tag read, Frank, a man in his late 40s with thinning blonde hair slicked backward like wet straw. His skin was sallow, and deep lines around his mouth hinted at a permanent dissatisfaction with life. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he had the temperament of someone who believed the world owed him something, and resented everyone who didn't pay. He crossed his arms, looking down at Mara with the condescending tilt of a man who held a sliver of power and relished it. "I told you already," Frank said, voice flat. "If you don't have money, I can't sell you anything. These are medicines, not charity donations." Mara's lower lip trembled. Ember let out a faint whimper, the sound so thin it was barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator units nearby. "Sir," she whispered, I'll pay you back. I swear I will. My paycheck comes Friday. Please. He's my family." Frank scoffed. "Then maybe you should have thought of that before picking up some stray animal you can't afford." Mara flinched as if struck. Jake felt something in his chest tighten, a familiar, unwelcome memory. He saw Ranger, his K9 partner, lying in his arms in a collapsing building overseas, bleeding out while dust and fire clouded the air. Ranger had been everything, loyal, brave, unflinching, and Jake had not been able to save him. That failure lived in him like a ghost, whispering every time he heard an animal cry in pain. Tonight, that ghost was screaming. Jake stepped deeper into the aisle, his presence impossible to ignore. The fluorescent lights caught the defined edges of his face, the tension in his jaw. His posture straightened naturally, spine aligned, shoulders squared. A soldier entering a silent battlefield. Mara didn't see him yet. Frank did. And Frank swallowed. Jake Roden had the energy of a man who did not raise his voice to win a confrontation. He didn't need to. Jake watched the exchange quietly for several seconds, gathering details the way SEALs were trained to. Mara's shaking hands, the pallor of the kitten's gums, the feverish heat radiating from the small body. The situation was simple. The desperation was not. When Frank turned away dismissively, Jake's voice cut through the aisle, low, gravel deep, steady as an anchor line. "She asked for help." Mara jolted, startled, and turned. She saw Jake, saw his height, his broad chest, the quiet hardness in his blue eyes, and instinctively stepped back. But the moment their eyes met, she felt something else. Safety. A stranger shouldn't make her feel safe. But he did. Frank pinched the bridge of his nose. "Sir, this is none of your business." Jake stepped closer, the dull ache in his ribs spiking as he moved, but he ignored it. Pain, to him, was a familiar companion. "It became my business," Jake said calmly, "when you chose to humiliate someone begging for help." Frank let out a dry laugh. "Oh, great. A hero." Jake didn't react. His face remained unreadable, controlled. Years of military discipline had trained every muscle not to betray anger, even when it lit up behind his eyes. But something colder entered his voice. "You're refusing over-the-counter antibiotic ointment and electrolyte solution to a dying kitten?" Frank's expression tightened defensively. "Store policy." "No," Jake said. "That's pettiness." Mara swallowed hard. She hugged Ember closer, the kitten's shallow breaths warming the fabric where her heart pressed against him. Tears built behind her eyes, not because of Frank's cruelty, but because the man standing in front of her was a stranger who spoke as if her pain mattered. "Please," she whispered to Jake, her voice cracking. "I don't know what else to do. I tried 4 places before this. Everything was closed." Jake finally looked at her, not at her wet hair, or her clothes, or her trembling hands, but into her eyes. And what he saw there, fear, love, exhaustion, pulled him cleanly out of the storm inside himself. "Let me help you," Jake said quietly. Mara's breath hitched. For a moment, something warm flickered through her cold, soaked body. Frank threw up his hands. "Fine. Do whatever you want. Just don't involve me when the corporate office asks why half the first aid shelf is missing." Jake held Mara's gaze for a moment longer, steady, grounding. Then he moved. He scanned the shelves, selecting items with swift precision, each movement disciplined, decisive. A pediatric electrolyte solution, a broad-spectrum antibiotic ointment, sterile gauze, disposable droppers, glucose gel, a digital thermometer. Mara watched him, stunned by how expertly he worked. He handled the supplies like a medic, but there was something deeper in his expression. A quiet grief hidden in the way he touched the kitten, as if he had held a fragile life like this before and lost it. When Jake reached the counter, he placed the items down with controlled force. "Ring it up," he said. Frank hesitated, annoyed but intimidated. Jake's height alone was enough to discourage argument. "Fine," Frank muttered, scanning each item. Jake paid, without blinking. Then he turned to Mara. "Come with me," he said gently. "He needs help now." Mara followed him out of the store, the storm swallowing them again as the door closed behind them. Jake led her to his dark SUV, and inside, in the dim light, a shape shifted in the back seat. A large Belgian Malinois with sleek black and tan fur, amber eyes, and pointed ears standing alert. This was Shadow, Jake's current K9 partner, 3 years old, trained in combat tracking, explosive detection, and tactical obedience. Shadow's posture was disciplined but calm, a soldier's composure. When he saw Ember in distress, his ears twitched forward, and he let out a low, sympathetic whine. Mara froze. He won't hurt us?" Jake smiled faintly, the first softness she had seen from him. "Shadow only bites when I tell him to, and I never bite people who don't deserve it." Shadow stepped closer, sniffed Ember gently, and let out a soft huff. Approval. Mara exhaled shakily. Jake opened the medical kit kept behind his seat. "Set him on your lap," he instructed. She obeyed. Jake began working, swabbing Ember's wound, carefully applying ointment, using a dropper to slowly drip electrolyte solution into the corner of the kitten's mouth. His hands were steady, gentle, the opposite of the killing efficiency those same hands were trained for. Mara watched with widened eyes. "You've done this before," she said quietly. Jake paused for a heartbeat. Pain flickered through his eyes, raw, invisible, but there. "Yes," he said. "I have." And though Mara didn't know it yet, he wasn't talking about kittens. When Ember finally drank a few weak drops of fluid, Mara gasped with relief. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were warm ones this time. Jake leaned back slightly, breathing hard from the strain on his ribcage, but he kept his expression neutral. "He's not safe yet," he said. "But he's fighting. That's all he needs for now." Mara looked at him, really looked, and something inside her cracked open, releasing days, months, years of held breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't understand why you're helping me, but thank you." Jake met her gaze through the dim light of the storm and the dashboard glow. His voice, when he finally answered, was low, steady, shaped by ghosts he rarely allowed to surface. "Because once," he said quietly, "someone I loved needed help, and I wasn't there in time." The storm raged on. Ember breathed deeper. Mara's heart steadied, and Jake Roden stepped silently, irrevocably, into her life. The night pressed heavily against the SUV windows, the storm still raging with the restless fury of something ancient, as if Seattle itself were trying to drown its own loneliness. Inside the vehicle, the air was warm and thick with the mingled sense of antiseptic, wet fur, and the quiet tension of two strangers whose lives had collided in a moment neither of them expected. Jake Rowden sat angled toward Mara Ellis, his large frame half shadowed by the dashboard glow. His breath remained steady, controlled, yet he felt the faint tremor of exhaustion deep in his ribs, where the old injury throbbed with every subtle twist of his body. But he ignored it. Pain was familiar. Pain made sense. What didn't make sense was the young woman sitting across from him, small, soaked, trembling, yet holding herself together with the stubborn resilience of someone who had learned to expect nothing from the world except responsibility. Mara watched Ember's shallow breathing while Jake worked, her amber eyes shimmering with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else. Something softer, something like wonder. She couldn't stop glancing at Jake's hands. They were large, calloused, hardened by years of dismantling weapons, climbing jagged terrain, and lifting wounded teammates from danger. But tonight, those same hands were gentle, precise, carrying a trembling kitten as though it were made of glass. Jake Roden was a contradiction wrapped in stormlight, a warrior who treated fragility with reverence. Shadow, the Malinois, sat poised behind Mara, his body tense yet controlled. His coat, sleek and dark, with a faint reddish sheen under the dim lights, rose and fell subtly with each deep, steady breath. His sharp amber eyes flickered between Mara's trembling movements and Jake's concentration, reading every detail like the trained combat partner he was. Ember gave a soft, broken mewl, and Shadow's ears perked. He leaned forward just enough that his warm breath brushed Mara's shoulder. Mara froze as the dog's nose gently touched the back of her hand. He let out a low, comforting rumble, approval, protection, maybe even solidarity between animals who understood suffering in a language humans often ignored. "He likes you," Jake murmured without looking up. "Shadow doesn't tolerate just anyone." Mara swallowed. He's beautiful." "He's a soldier," Jake said simply. He finished applying the ointment and slipped the medical tools back into his kit. He leaned against the seat, pressing a hand discreetly to his ribcage as he exhaled shallowly. Mara noticed the strain ripple across his jaw. "You're hurt," she said. Jake's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward her. A brief, surprised acknowledgement. Few people noticed when he was disguising pain. "It's nothing," he said. Mara shook her head. "You flinched when you reached for the gauze." Jake's voice was gentle but final. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Mara looked down, cheeks warming. She wasn't used to someone treating her concerns as unnecessary. She had spent most of her life being ignored, but Jake wasn't dismissing her out of arrogance. He did it out of habit, the habit of a man who bore every weight himself, because he had no idea how to let someone else help. Ember stirred again. Jake reached out, checking the kitten's gums, lifting one tiny paw to see if circulation was improving. Mara watched him closely, the way his eyes softened when he looked at Ember, the way his shoulders lowered by a fraction, as though tending the fragile creature quieted something inside him. "You've saved animals before," she said softly. "Not animals," Jake murmured. His voice cracked ever so slightly, a fracture only someone standing very close could hear. "Partners." Mara didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had seen enough pain in others to recognize when a wound was too deep to reopen. For a moment, silence filled the SUV, not tense, but heavy with unspoken things. Then Jake cleared his throat and shifted. "Where do you live?" She hesitated. "A few blocks from here, an apartment. Well, a basement room." "Is someone there?" She shook her head. "My mother's in the hospital tonight. She sleeps most days now. It's just me." Jake nodded. It wasn't pity in his eyes. Jake did not pity people. He understood them. He saw her exhaustion, her raw fear, her stubborn loyalty. She was a caretaker, a protector, roles Jake respected more than almost anything. "Let me drive you home," he said. "He needs warmth, and you need rest." Mara's instinct was to refuse. Years of poverty had carved a reflexive fear of accepting too much kindness, but exhaustion weighed her down, and Ember's tiny heartbeat pulsed weakly beneath her fingers. She nodded. "Okay." Jake started the engine. The SUV hummed to life, headlights cutting spears of white across the rivering streets. As they drove, the storm softened slightly, though rain still trickled in the uneven streaks across the windshield. Mara cradled Ember close to her chest. Shadow rested his chin on the back seat, watching her with a soldier's discipline. Jake drove with the posture of someone who treated even city streets like a tactical zone, hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning thresholds, corners, reflections, and puddles. His jaw tightened when thunder cracked overhead, not from fear, but instinct. Fighting instinct. Mara studied him in quiet fascination. "Do storms bother you?" she asked gently. He didn't answer for several seconds. "Not storms," he said finally. "Just memories that come with them." His voice was low, almost hollow. Shadow shifted, nudging the back of Jake's shoulder with his snout. Jake reached up and brushed a hand along the dog's head, the touch both grateful and grounding. They drove past shuttered shops, flickering streetlights, puddles reflecting neon signs. The world outside felt strangely distant, quieted by rain, distorted by glass. "This is it," Mara whispered, pointing to a narrow building with crumbling brick and a rusted metal railing. Jake parked. When Mara opened the door, Shadow hopped out instantly, landing gracefully, ears alert. Jake followed more slowly, careful of his ribs. Mara led them down a flight of concrete steps, slick with rain, into a dim hallway lit by a single yellow bulb. Her door was at the end, a cheap wooden panel splintering at the edges. Inside, the room was small but immaculate. A narrow bed with mismatched blankets, a tiny table stacked with medical bills, a thrift store lamp that buzzed faintly when Mara turned it on. The air smelled of detergent and damp carpet. Ember stirred in her arms. Jake stepped inside, scanning the room with instinctive tactical awareness. Entry points, blind angles, potential hazards. When he turned back to Mara, his expression softened. "You keep it clean," she nodded. "It's all I can afford, but I try." Her voice broke on the last word. Not from shame, from exhaustion. Jake felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had seen villages and war zones with more chaos and less hardship than the life she carried on her shoulders. Mara sat on the bed, and Jake knelt beside her, checking Ember again. The kitten's temperature had eased slightly. It was enough to breathe, enough to hope. "He'll make it through the night," Jake said quietly. Mara looked at him as though he had given her the world. Her eyes welled, but she blinked the tears back, embarrassed. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe me anything," Jake said. She shook her head. No one's ever helped me like this." Jake held her gaze. He was close enough now that she could see the tiny flecks of gray near his temples, the faint stubble along his jaw, the hard planes of his cheekbones, the ghost of a wound in his eyes. "Everyone deserves help," Jake said. "No," Mara whispered. "Not everyone believes that." Jake looked away. He didn't argue because she was right. He had met people who would let a life suffer simply because it cost them nothing to ignore it. Tonight had proven that. Shadow wandered to Mara, sniffed Ember, then nudged her hand. Mara smiled despite herself. "He's very sweet." Jake chuckled softly. "He's a soldier, but he knows kindness when he sees it." Mara blushed. Jake didn't notice. He was too busy fighting the warmth blooming unexpectedly in his chest. Warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But when he looked back at her, really looked, he felt something shift, something dangerous, something alive. Mara brushed Ember's fur. "He's all I have left," she whispered. Jake's voice was quiet. "You're not alone tonight." Mara stared at him, her breath catching. Shadow laid his head on Jake's knee, sensing the storm inside his handler. Jake lifted a hand and rested it gently on Ember's back, not just to soothe the kitten, but to anchor himself. He had walked into this night expecting pain, exhaustion, and an empty apartment. Instead, he had found a trembling kitten, a girl with a warrior's heart, and a reminder of why he had once believed in protecting people beyond the battlefield. For the first time in years, something inside Jake Roden began to thaw, and he wasn't sure whether that terrified him or saved him. Ember let out a tiny sigh. Mara smiled through tears. Jake's heart, long locked behind walls of grief and discipline, stirred faintly in the quiet of that small basement room, as if answering a call he had not realized he was waiting to hear. The basement room glowed dimly beneath the weak bulb hanging from the ceiling, a trembling circle of yellow light barely reaching the corners where shadows pooled like tired ghosts. Outside, rain still battered the world, but inside, Mara Ellis's small rented space, time felt suspended, wrapped in the fragile quiet that settles over people too exhausted to fear anything more. Jake Roden stood near the doorway, letting his vision sweep the room with instinctive precision. The habit was ingrained. Check entries, blind zones, places where danger could hide. It wasn't paranoia. It was discipline forged through war. But as he looked, he found no threats here, only the quiet dignity of a woman surviving under conditions that would have broken others. The room was small enough that his tall frame nearly brushed the hanging bulb when he stepped fully inside. The walls, once white, were mottled with damp stains that crept upward like the tracks of forgotten rainstorms. A patch on the ceiling sagged ominously, swollen from leaks that Mara had likely endured without complaint. Yet everything was clean, spotless, almost aggressively orderly. Not a dish out of place, not a garment on the floor. She lived with the pride of someone who refused to surrender to circumstance. Mara gently laid Ember on a folded towel on her bed, her hands trembling as she watched the kitten's breathing falter again. Ember was so small, so heartbreakingly fragile. His fur, usually bright orange, looked muted under the sickly light, clinging to his skinny frame. His eyes were half-lidded, clouded with fever, yet flickering faintly toward Mara's voice. "Stay with me, sweet boy," Mara whispered, brushing a finger along his tiny head. Her voice cracked like ice beneath weight. Jake set down his medical kit and approached slowly, his boots sinking softly into the worn carpet that had likely seen years of other tenants. other struggles. Shadow followed close behind him, the dog's movements so smooth and deliberate they almost resembled liquid muscle. Shadow always moved silently, as though the world bowed slightly to let him pass. The Malinois padded toward the bed and curled beside it, placing his head gently on Mara's knee. The gesture caught her by surprise, her breath stuttering as the warmth of the trained war dog seeped into her cold legs. Mara had not been touched with kindness in a long time, not by people, not by animals, not by life. And somehow this dog sensed exactly where her heart was breaking. Mara brushed her fingers through Shadow's dark fur. "You're amazing," she whispered. Shadow blinked, slow and solemn, as though accepting her gratitude on behalf of all living things that still believed she was worth helping. Jake watched them, something warm tightening in his chest. It was the same feeling he had felt earlier in the SUV, the dangerous sensation of thawing after years of emotional frost. "How long has he been sick?" Jake asked, softly. Mara swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "He started throwing up this morning, then the fever, then he stopped eating." Her eyes grew distant, her inner walls peeling back as she let herself speak freely. Maybe for the first time in months. "I found him behind the grocery store 2 months ago. Someone had thrown him out in a shoebox. I didn't have the heart to walk away." Jake nodded slowly. "You did the right thing." She shook her head. "Everyone tells me I shouldn't take on more than I can handle, but he looked at me like he didn't understand why the world hated him so much. Now, I know that look." Jake understood that look too. Too well. He stepped closer to Ember, feeling heat radiate from the kitten's tiny body. The fever was rising again, too fast. Mara sensed it too, her breath quickening. "Jake," she whispered, "he's getting worse, isn't he?" Jake didn't lie, not to people who deserve truth. "He needs more than what I can do here." Mara wiped her eyes, panic building like a storm tide. "But I can't afford an emergency vet. I barely paid rent this month. I can't—" Her voice fractured, splintered into quiet sobs that she pressed her fist against to muffle. Jake's hand hovered near her shoulder for a second, hesitant, as though he weren't sure if he was allowed to offer her comfort. But then he placed it gently there, warmth seeping through her thin coat. "I know someone," Jake murmured. "A vet. Good man. He's retired military. Seen worse than this." Mara blinked through tears, disbelief straining her voice. You'd call him? At this hour?" "For you?" Jake said softly. "For Ember? Yes." She looked at him, vulnerable and stunned, as though she couldn't understand why a man like him, a man made of steel and stormlight, would step into her life in such a gentle way. Jake stepped back and pulled out his phone. Shadow lifted his head, ears perking at the familiar tone Jake used, the quiet command voice reserved for urgent but controlled matters. Jake dialed. The call rang once, twice. "Pick up," he whispered. A groggy, raspy voice answered. "If this isn't someone dying or a dog in crisis, I'm hanging up." "Doc," Jake said, "I wouldn't call if it wasn't." On the other end, Dr. Samuel Rourke inhaled sharply. He was a man in his late 50s, tall, wiry, with silver hair cut short and a beard trimmed close to his jaw. His face bore the rugged wear of someone who had spent decades in both military tents and makeshift clinics, patching up soldiers and K-9 teams in the middle of nowhere. He was known for being blunt, sarcastic, and immeasurably skilled. Jake owed him his life, twice. "Explain," Rourke snapped. Jake did, short, precise, clinical. When he finished, the line was silent for a beat. Then, "Address," Jake told him. "I'll be there in 15. The call ended. Mara stared at Jake, her lips parted. In astonishment. "He's coming? Really coming? Tonight?" Jake nodded. "He doesn't say no to me." He didn't explain why. She didn't ask. They were beginning to understand each other, even in silence. 15 minutes felt like an hour as Mara sat on the bed, stroking Ember with trembling fingers, whispering soft promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Jake stood near the door, every sense alert out of habit, though the neighborhood was too quiet for danger. His mind drifted, unwillingly, to Ranger. He pictured his partner's final moments in that collapsing building, the choking dust, the heat, the sound of metal groaning as the ceiling failed. He had held Ranger's head, whispered, "Stay with me," the same way Mara whispered to Ember now. But Ranger hadn't stayed. and Jake had never forgiven himself. Maybe that was why helping Ember felt like oxygen, like redemption. A knock echoed through the small room. Jake opened the door, revealing Dr. Samuel Rourke, who looked exactly as Jake remembered. He stood 6 feet tall, lean but solid, with broad shoulders narrowed slightly by age. His hair was silver, his beard peppered with white. His skin was tanned from years spent outdoors, weathered around the eyes. He wore a battered leather jacket over a gray sweater, jeans, and boots that had definitely walked through war zones at some point. His eyes, sharp, steely blue, swept the room with the intensity of a man who could diagnose a situation before stepping fully inside. "Where's the patient?" Rourke asked. No greeting, no small talk. Jake smirked faintly. "Good to see you too, Doc." Yeah. Emotions," Rourke grumbled. "Show me the cat." Mara tensed as he approached. Rourke noticed, softening just a fraction. "Name?" Mara," she whispered. "And this is Ember." "Cute," Rourke said. "Sick as hell, but cute." His tone was blunt but not unkind, like a man who had spent decades saving lives in chaos and had no patience left for formalities. He knelt beside the bed and examined Ember with quick, practiced movements, checking temperature, hydration, heart rate. Mara couldn't stop fidgeting. Her hands clutched together tightly enough that her knuckles blanched. She looked at Jake, silent panic rising in her eyes. Jake stepped closer to her, letting his presence steady her, even without touching her. Dr. Rourke leaned back. "He's not beyond saving," he said finally. Mara broke into tears of relief. "But," Rourke continued, "he needs fluids, antibiotics, and monitoring. It'll be a long night." Mara nodded rapidly. "Whatever he needs." "Good answer," Rourke said. He set up an IV line with swift efficiency. Jake held Ember still while Rourke inserted the tiny catheter. His movements were careful, tender even, as he whispered reassurance to the kitten under his breath. Mara watched with awe. After the IV was secure, Rourke pulled out a small syringe of antibiotics. "He'll hate this," he warned. Ember mewled softly as the medicine went in. Mara sniffed, brushing tears away. "You're doing amazing, baby," she whispered to Ember. Shadow scooted closer, laying his head gently on Mara's thigh again. She stroked his ears with shaking fingers, her breath steadying. Jake watched, his chest warming at the sight. For once, the night didn't feel hostile. It felt like a moment suspended between strangers who had become unlikely allies. After finishing the treatment, Rourke stood, knees cracking slightly as he straightened. "He's stable enough now," he said. "Make sure he stays warm. If anything changes, call me." Mara stood abruptly, wiping her cheeks. "Dr. Rourke, thank you. Truly." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Then, softer than before, he said, "You saved him by bringing him this far. I just helped." Mara blinked rapidly. Jake caught the small tremor in her shoulders. He stepped just a little closer. "Thank you, Doc," he said. "Owe you one." "You owe me nothing," Rourke said, "but I'll take a beer next week." He left without ceremony, the door closing behind him with a quiet thud. Mara stood in the center of the room, her body shaking. Relief, exhaustion, fear, gratitude, all of it collided inside her. Then, without warning, she sank to her knees on the floor, burying her face in her hands as sobs tore from her chest. Jake reacted instantly. He knelt beside her, his large hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on her back. Shadow pressed against her side. Mara cried harder, not from despair, but from the overwhelming reality that for the first time in her life, someone had stepped between her and the storm. And stayed. "It's all right," Jake murmured. "He's safe now." "You're safe." Mara looked up at him, her eyes swollen and shining. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" Jake held her gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve someone in your corner. Because nobody should fight alone." For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of his presence, the steady beat of Shadow's breathing, and Ember's soft, rhythmic breaths on the bed. In that forgotten little room, 3 lives that had been fractured by loss found something fragile but real, connection. And together, they fought the night. Morning arrived quietly, as though the world itself feared disturbing the fragile peace that had settled over Mara's small basement room during the long hours of the night. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a gentle drizzle that tapped against the narrow window pane like soft fingers. The faint gray glow slipping into the room, mixed with the warm lamplight still burning from the night before, spreading across the walls in muted golden stripes that made the peeling paint look almost poetic rather than forgotten. Jake Roden had fallen asleep, sitting upright in the lone wooden chair beside the bed, his long legs stretched out, arms folded loosely across his chest. Even in sleep, his posture held a soldier's vigilance, head angled slightly as though he were listening for threats, back straight despite the discomfort, breathing steady and controlled. Shadow lay curled at his boots, his dark coat rising and falling in slow, rhythmic waves. He slept, but slept alertly, every sense lightly tethered to his handler's heartbeat. He had watched the night with the same patience Jake had taught him: silence, stillness, readiness. Mara had drifted off only briefly before dawn, exhaustion folding her like a soft blanket. Now she woke slowly, her eyes blinking open to the dim light. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was or why her chest felt swollen with emotions she wasn't used to feeling. Then she saw Ember. The tiny kitten was breathing easier, still weak, still fragile, but alive. His fur looked slightly less dull, and when Mara brushed a finger across his head, his ear twitched weakly. The relief spread through her like warmth in winter. Tears filled her eyes instantly, unbidden but welcome. She stared at the sleeping figures in her room: Jake, slumped but steady like a silent guardian, and Shadow, disciplined even in rest. Mara didn't know how long she watched them, but she memorized every detail: the faint stubble along Jake's jaw, the lines near his eyes that softened in sleep, the subtle rise and fall of the dog's ribcage. She felt something bloom inside her, something delicate and quiet. Gratitude so deep, it came close to prayer. Jake stirred as though sensing her awakening. His eyelids fluttered once, then opened, revealing eyes still sharp despite the lack of rest. He straightened, wincing slightly as his ribcage protested. Mara sat up quickly. "Jake, you're hurt. You should have gone home." He met her worried gaze, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't want to leave you alone while he was fighting through the night." Ember gave a faint, raspy meow, as if offering his own small greeting. Jake leaned toward the bed, his expression softening as he checked the kitten's breathing. "He's stable, that's good." Mara's voice cracked with relief. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Jake said gently. "You saved him by not giving up." Mara shook her head, overwhelmed. The night had changed everything, not just Ember's fate, but the invisible weight she had been carrying alone for so long. Jake stood slowly, stretching, and Shadow rose with him, alert and ready as though the day's mission had just begun. Mara watched the pair, the soldier and the dog, moving in a perfect rhythm of loyalty and discipline. "Do your ribs still hurt?" she asked softly. Jake hesitated, then exhaled through his nose with a faint smirk of resignation. "Yeah, a bit." "A bit meaning a lot," she corrected gently. He didn't deny it. Shadow nudged Jake's hand with a soft grunt, as though agreeing with Mara's assessment. Jake chuckled quietly and scratched the dog's head. "Traitor." Mara bit back a smile, her heart tugging in a way she didn't quite understand. Jake checked the time on his watch. "I should get you something to eat. You didn't have dinner." "Jake, you've done enough. It's not up for debate," he said, not unkindly. "You won't be any help to Ember if you collapse." Mara's lips parted with surprise. He cared, not just about the cat, but about her. It was disarming, unsettling, wonderful. Jake left briefly, Shadow staying behind to watch over Mara and Ember, as though Jake had assigned him the sacred duty of protecting the fragile world inside this small room. When Jake returned 20 minutes later with warm breakfast sandwiches and 2 cups of coffee, his jacket was speckled with raindrops and his hair slightly damp. "Here," he said, handing her a sandwich and a steaming cup. "Eat." She took them with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you." "You're welcome." They ate quietly but comfortably, the silence no longer heavy with fear, but filled with something gentle, steady. After breakfast, Jake walked toward the door and pulled a folded envelope from his jacket. Mara blinked. "What's that?" "Rent," Jake said simply. For next month. Her entire body stiffened. Jake, no, I can't accept. You can, he said, tone calm but firm. And you should. Mara shook her head, tears forming again. Not the violent tears of fear, but the softer ones that came from kindness too great to grasp. You don't understand. I can't let you, Mara. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The grounded steadiness of a man who did nothing without intent. You don't have to repay me with money. I'm not buying anything from you. Her voice was a whisper. Then why? Because life has been kicking you for a long time, Jake said quietly, and someone should finally stand between you and the next blow. That's all. Mara covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to cry again. She didn't want to seem fragile, but Jake's kindness cracked her open in the most unexpected way. Besides, Jake said with a faint smile, I already made plans that require you to have a roof over your head. She blinked. Plans? A job, he answered. If you want it. Mara froze completely. Her breath stilled. Her heart pounded. Jake continued. There's a position open at the naval base. Kitchen staff, stable hours, good environment, safe area, reliable pay. He offered the words gently, like he knew each one was landing softly but powerfully inside her. I spoke with the chief petty officer this morning. He's willing to meet you tomorrow. Mara stared at him as though he had just changed the shape of her universe. Why would they hire me? Jake shrugged lightly. Because you've been working 3 jobs already just trying to survive. That's grit. The Navy respects grit. Mara's lips trembled. You did this for me? I didn't do anything, Jake said, shaking his head. You'll do the work. I just opened a door. She didn't know how to respond. Words seemed too small. Instead, she reached forward and took Jake's hand, hesitantly, gently, but with unfiltered emotion. Her skin was warm against his scarred knuckles. I don't know a person like you exists outside of stories, she whispered. Jake felt her fingers around his, soft but steady. He swallowed quietly. For a man accustomed to bullets and explosions, nothing had ever shaken him the way her touch did. His voice was quiet. A soldier doesn't just protect a country. He protects the people in it who can't fight alone. Shadow trotted forward and placed his paw on Mara's leg, as if echoing Jake's sentiment. Mara laughed softly, brushing Shadow's ear. Ember stirred weakly and let out the faintest meow. Mara looked at him, then at Jake, her voice a whisper filled with awe. He's going to live. Jake nodded, his smile small but sincere. Yes, he is. Mara's eyes shone like the first light after a storm. Because of you. Jake shook his head. No, he said gently. Because someone refused to let him die alone. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The basement room, the old walls, the flickering lamp, the worn carpet. All of it felt illuminated by a brightness that came not from the bulb overhead, but from something beginning to grow quietly between them. A new light in an old house. 3 months later, Seattle had traded the harsh winter storms for a gentler spring, the kind that softened the city's hard edges with blooming cherry blossoms and brighter skies. The naval base hummed with activity as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the world in a warm gold that seemed to cling to every surface. It was the kind of morning that promised possibility, fresh starts, second chances, and the quiet beginnings of stories that no longer carried the weight of loneliness. Jake Roden walked across the asphalt toward the staff parking area, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with the steady, confident gait of a soldier who had done this too many times to count, leaving for another mission, slipping into danger like it was a second home. His hair was still cut short, though the early gray at his temples had deepened slightly. His jawline looked sharper than before, a result of intense pre-deployment training, and a faint bruising along his knuckles hinted at recent combat drills. But the biggest difference was in his eyes. Their storm blue hue now held something that hadn't been there in years. Warmth, hope, a quiet tether to a world outside the battlefield. Shadow trotted at his heel, tail high, amber eyes alert and full of purpose. The Malinois looked stronger too, sleek, muscular, conditioned from daily runs and drills. Jake had trained him harder these months, preparing him for the upcoming overseas assignment. Yet even now, Shadow's gaze occasionally softened, flicking upward toward Jake with the devotion of a creature who understood every vibration of his handler's emotions. Jake paused near the exit gate and checked his watch. He had time, barely. Enough to keep a promise he made silently to himself every night since the storm. He climbed into his SUV, Shadow leaping into the back seat with practiced precision. The engine rumbled to life, and they drove toward a small, familiar neighborhood on the city's quieter outskirts. Mara Ellis now lived in a modest ground-floor unit of a renovated apartment building provided by the job at the Naval Base kitchen. The building itself wasn't fancy, light brick, square windows, a small courtyard in front, but it was safe, warm, and filled with light. Jake parked near the entrance. Shadow let out an eager woof, recognizing the place instantly. "Yeah," Jake murmured, rubbing the dog's head. "We're home for a moment." He didn't knock. He didn't have to. The door swung open before he even reached the steps. Mara stood framed in the doorway, sunlight wrapping around her like a soft halo. She looked different now, stronger, brighter. Her once wet and trembling hair was now brushed neatly, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her cheeks carried a faint, healthy glow, and her amber-brown eyes were steady, no longer haunted by fear. She wore a simple navy blue work shirt from the Naval Base kitchen, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The fit wasn't glamorous, but it suited her, practical, clean, proud. "Jake!" she breathed, her smile blooming with warmth. Ember darted between her ankles, now almost full-grown. His orange fur was vibrant and thick, his movements energetic as he bounded forward with a happy chirp. He rubbed his head against Jake's boot, then hopped around Shadow in excited circles. Shadow tolerated the enthusiasm with noble patience, allowing Ember's antics while maintaining his dignified posture. Mara laughed, a sound that had grown more common these months, soft yet confident. "He's been waiting by the window since sunrise. I think he knew you were coming." Jake smiled, the expression gentle and rare. Shadow did the same. Mara stepped back to let him in, but Jake lifted a hand. "I can't stay long," he said softly. "I'm shipping out at noon." Her smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "I know. I figured today was the day." There was no fear in her tone, only concern, only quiet strength. She had learned to stand in the storm without shaking. Jake reached into the pocket of his tactical jacket and pulled out a small object wrapped in thin leather cord. "Here," he said. Mara unfolded the leather wrap carefully. A small, polished claw rested inside. A training shed claw from Shadow, preserved and smoothed until it shone faintly in the morning light. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is something important," he finished for her. "Shadow lost it during a training cycle 2 years ago. I kept it because it got him through a rough winter exercise. But now," he gently closed her fingers around the charm. "Now, it's for you." Mara looked at him, eyes bright with emotion that both scared and steadied her. "Why me?" Jake inhaled slowly, searching for the right words. Shadow sat beside him, tail thumping softly against the ground. "Because Shadow protects the people I trust," Jake said quietly. "And there's no one I trust more than you." Mara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, filled with sunlight and the quiet hum of something deeper, something unspoken. She blinked hard to steady her voice. "I'll take care of it, always." Jake nodded, relief flickering across his features. He wasn't a man who gave pieces of himself easily. This gesture meant more than Mara could truly understand. "You've changed," Jake said suddenly. Not as an accusation, but an observation. Mara smiled softly. "You helped me find my strength again. I just didn't know I had any left." Ember hopped onto her shoulder, purring loudly, and Mara scratched his chin absent-mindedly. Jake watched her, something tightening in his chest, not painful, but warm, anchoring. "And you?" she asked. "Have you changed?" He exhaled slowly. "A little," he admitted. "You and Ember reminded me that there's more to fight for than just staying alive." Shadow nudged Jake's hand, then stepped toward Mara, placing his paw gently on her foot. Mara laughed again. "Shadow agrees." Jake crouched down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Take care of her, all right?" Shadow barked once, firm, solemn, a soldier's promise. Mara knelt too, resting a hand on Shadow's strong neck. "I'll take care of him too," she said, her voice warm and steady. "When you're gone, I'll make sure he has a place to come home to." Jake's throat tightened. Words became harder to form, not because he didn't have them, but because he didn't know how to shape them without revealing more than he was allowed to feel. A military transport truck turned the corner at the end of the street, its engine humming deeply. It slowed near Jake's SUV, waiting. Mara stood slowly, Ember perched on her shoulder like a small guardian spirit. "Come back to us," she whispered. Jake stepped closer and rested his forehead briefly against hers. Not quite a kiss, but something intimate in its quietness. "I will," he murmured. "I promise." Then he pulled back, his eyes locking with hers for a long, steady heartbeat. He turned, lifted his duffel bag into the truck, and motioned for Shadow to climb in. The Malinois obeyed instantly, but pressed his head out the window the moment he was inside. As the truck rolled forward, Shadow kept his gaze fixed on Mara. Ember meowed insistently from her shoulder, stretching his little paw toward the departing vehicle. Mara lifted her hand and waved, tears slipping down her cheeks, but her smile unwavering. "We'll be right here," she called. "Both of us!" Jake didn't look away until the truck turned onto the highway. And as it disappeared into the horizon, the early morning sun broke fully over the rooftops, bathing Mara and Ember in a radiant, hopeful gold, like a blessing for the new world they had built together, piece by fragile piece. The soldier's heart, once frozen beneath years of loss, now carried the warmth of a home waiting for him. And the girl who once stood trembling in the storm now stood strong beneath the rising sun. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or angels or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a soldier who refuses to walk away, through a frightened girl who finds her courage, through a tiny animal who chooses to keep fighting, and through the small, unseen acts of kindness that God uses to rewrite a life. Jake, Mara, Shadow, and Ember remind us of a truth we often forget in the rush of everyday life. Miracles are not always supernatural. They are the moments when compassion meets courage, when strangers become family, and when hope rises exactly where darkness once lived. Maybe your miracle is still on its way. Maybe you are the miracle waiting to happen in someone else's storm. And maybe, just maybe, God is already placing the right people, the right opportunities, and the right second chances in your path, even if you can't see them yet. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of courage, kindness, and faith. May God bless you and your loved ones, guide your steps, strengthen your spirit, and protect your home, just as He protected them under that stormy Seattle sky. If you believe that kindness can create miracles, type Amen in the comments below.